Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Richardson, and today I want to talk to you about the Great Depression. But before we get into that, I want you to think about a few questions. How would you have survived the Great Depression? There's no work, there's little to no food for you or for your family. So, how did Americans survive? How did America itself survive? And as we've learned through history, and recently through the Great Recession, that history is a cycle. And most historians and economists studying this cycle and studying our current economic and political situation are predicting that we could be headed for another recession or even another depression. So why did I choose to talk to you today about the Great Depression? Well, in fact, I absolutely love history, and I want to become a history teacher. And my favorite time period of all the world's history is between World War I and World War II, and right in the middle of that is the Great Depression. And so today we'll be discussing how the Great Depression earned its name. From that, we will be discussing the Dust Bowl, how the market crash and banking panic caused the Great Depression to last even longer, how government inaction and action affected the Great Depression, and then finally, the road to recovery that America undertook to be able to become what it is today. Now, the Dust Bowl, according to History.com, was affected an area of 150,000 square miles, encompassing Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, into Colorado and New Mexico and sections of Kansas. Now, this was caused by little to no rainfall, the abuse of the soil in the area by repeatedly farming the same crop over and over again, and high winds. Now, this perfect storm created the Dust Bowl and removed much of the topsoil, which was what the farmers used to create their crops. Now, this dust storm and the Dust Bowl caused a migration of 60% of the population of that area out west or back east, abandoning the Midwest and this farming community, which, as the agricultural farming groups of America failed, it caused America to be depleted on food sources, which made the Great Depression even worse. Now, at the time of the Dust Bowl, the market crashed, and so this perfect storm hurt the Dust Bowl area even more. Now, according to PBS, the price of a bushel of wheat sank from $2, which would be approximately about $24 to $25 now, to about 40 cents, which would be $11 now. Now, this failure in crop prices caused a lot of the farmers to panic. Now, in this panic, they created what was called bumper crops. So they planted whatever they could in any of the area that was left empty, and now this created even more of an abuse of the soil, which made it even harder to recover from the Dust Bowl. Now, going into the market crash and the banking panic. Now, in less than a week during the Great Depression, over 29 million shares of stock were sold off. So this created a rather large panic in America. As all these shares were sold off, it caused some banks to fail. And now, with that, a lot of people began to fear. As the banks were starting to fail, they began to remove their money. They could sense that America was going into this economic depression. So they wanted the money that they could have. And so by withdrawing all of their money that they could, it caused even more banks to fail. And to give a sense of how desperate the economic climate was, I feel one of the most telling images is this woman who felt that she had to resort to selling her children. And as you can see, that she's quite ashamed of this. But the economic situation was so desperate that she felt that she needed to resort to selling her children in order to ensure her own survival. Now, I know many of us couldn't think to sell our own children, but the fact is that many people felt that was their only way out. And at this time, over 15 million people were out of work. And we know that when a person is out of work, not only is that person suffering, but their family is as well. And during this time, many people had those dependents that were looking to them for that source of income, that source of food that they needed. And at this time also, as we know today, we have unemployment insurance. But that is a result of the Great Depression, as there was none during this time period. And another image that I have tells about a man who was desperately looking for work, and he wore this sign. And it says, "I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, and no work for 3 months. But I only want 1 job." So this man, who can do 3 trades, and it doesn't tell us what trades, but considering if this man could have been an auto mechanic, an electrician, and a plumber for 3 trades, and he couldn't find work, how desperate does that show the economic situation of America was? And not only was America's economy crashing, but other world economies crashed. And this was partially affected by the gold standard, as economies through the world were intertwined and worked together. And as all the different world economies crashed, no one could help anyone else out. So many nations had to resort to helping themselves. And the problem with that for America at the time was President Hoover and the main Republican idea that the government did not serve the people, but that the people were born to serve the government itself. And so many people, to mock Hoover as this Great Depression set in, had to live in these shanty towns, which they named Hoovervilles, to mock him. And I have an image of a Hooverville as well. And what I feel is very telling about this image is that you can see in the foreground the Hooverville, but in the background there is that thriving city. And it shows that great contrast of the haves and the have-nots. And Hoovervilles were built out of whatever materials could be found. Wood, tin, aluminum, whatever. You built your little shanty out of that. And each one of these houses actually is a representation of one family. So, while many people their only mission was just for them to survive or for their family to survive, and the government was not helping them at all. And the only act that President Hoover actually really made was to try and motivate America to an idea of volunteerism, which would typically work, but in the Great Depression it couldn't work, as volunteerism is the belief to get families to help one another to build the community, get communities to work together to build up their city, and so on and so forth, from the city to the state and the state to the federal. But this could not work, as the U.S. federal government owned over 50% of U.S. assets. And we saw in the image of the Hoovervilles, if you're building your house out of whatever scraps you can find, you haven't had work, you have barely any food, you can't really share and give any strength to your community when you are barely surviving as well. So this led to a great win for America through President Roosevelt. That came in later. Now, President Roosevelt, many historians are not, there's a debate among historians of whether President Roosevelt actually helped or hindered the recovery of the Great Depression. Now, during this recovery, as most of us know, is called the New Deal, the U.S. government purchased over 11 million acres of land in the area that was affected by the Dust Bowl to remove it out of production, to give it time to rest, to be able to grow those crops again later. Now, not only is that part of the New Deal, but the NRA was created. And this is very different than the NRA we have today. This NRA was the National Recovery Administration. So this was a specific administration, part of the government, specifically focused on the recovery of America. And that was its whole point. It created work at the state levels. It created a lot of bureaucracy. While we see that now as a bad thing, during the Great Depression, it allowed people to have work. Now with this as well, he created a banking holiday, which stopped all banks and allowed them to recover and then reopen. We also have the FDIC that we have now to ensure that even if our bank crashes, that our money is insured by the federal government, that we will be able to get it back. We also had the Wagner Act, which created unions. Now, unions during the Great Depression are very different than the unions that we have today, as unions during the Great Depression were specifically designed as workers for a specific company to bound together to have the courage to talk to their bosses without the fear of being fired, that they didn't have to fear their family starving again, that they would be able to fight for one another and help each other without that fear of becoming unemployed again. And one major contributor to the recovery of the world economies, and America in specific, was World War II. Many economies during this time were very war-driven, as war caused everyone to be employed. Most able-bodied men went to fight. Most women took the jobs that were left open by these men that left to fight, and those men that were unable to go and fight ended up taking factory jobs as well. Now, to review the main points, we discussed the Great Depression. The Great Depression caused by the Dust Bowl, the banking panic, the market crash, the double dip of the economy caused by inaction of the government and action of the government, and America's long, hard road to recovery. And that is how the Great Depression earned its name. And even though most economists and historians agree that by studying our political climate and economic situation, that America could be headed for another recession or depression, but we have learned from the Great Depression that America not only can survive, but it can thrive.